Let's begin our class with a prayer. Gracious and loving God, thank you for an opportunity to study your word today and to think about you. I pray that you quicken our imaginations and help us find ourselves in new ways in these old stories. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So today's story is something that I think is iconic and familiar, but it's not without its own mysteries. It's from John chapter 8. It's the woman caught in adultery. But I want to say some things about it before we talk about it. I mean, it's not without a little bit of mystery because, quite frankly, it's not in all ancient manuscripts. We're going to talk about that for just a minute. We're going to talk about why maybe it got passed around a little bit like a hot potato. But before we do that, I want to talk about John's Gospel in general to help us have an overall geography of this library that we call the Bible. So we've got 4 Gospels, and the first 3 are called the Synoptic Gospels, which simply means with optic, and it means seen with the same view, which simply means that the Gospel of Mark, the second one, almost all of Mark is found within Matthew and Luke. So the 3 of those are pretty much told the same way. And as I mentioned in my sermon this morning, and if you come in at 11, you'll hear it, I mentioned that over half of these stories take place in Galilee, in a 10-mile arc on the north shore of the lake, Galilee. In other words, all the stories that you know in these first 3 happen within 10 miles, which is remarkable, really. And they're pastoral, and they center on all the stories that you know, the feeding of the 5,000, and Jesus walking on the water, and still in a storm, and all those little pastoral stories from that country, little country part of the world where people know each other, and they live in little places like Capernaum, Bethsaida, stuff like that. So the first 3 are centered in their country. The first 3 are centered in the Galilee, in their country. They also center on a particular festival. They use a festival to as a shape of the gospel, if you will. So I want to remind you how people worshipped in the world of Jesus. You would go every Sabbath day to the synagogue. You'd worship there, and you'd study the law, and you would say your prayers. It'd be like a community meeting. But one time a year for the entirety of your life, or 3, if you could swing it or afford it, you would travel to Jerusalem for worship. And there were 3 main festivals that would beckon you to the city of Jerusalem. The first one in the year would be Passover. The second one would be Pentecost. And these are all harvest festivals. And then the third one in the fall would be Sukkot, S-U-K-K-O-T. That's the fall festival. And it's interesting that the first 3 Gospels use this festival as a lens through which to understand the story of Jesus, particularly the Passover. Remember, our communion words are Passover words. We call Jesus the Passover Lamb, sacrificed, the last sacrificed. Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us, deliver us from the bondage of sin and death. And all of our communion words are Exodus words and Passover words. And we do this because the first 3 Gospels use the Passover as, if you will, the lens through which to see the Gospels. Okay, that's the first 3. But we're going to talk about John's Gospel today, the 4th. And it's different. It's different than the others. First of all, the first 3 were written fairly soon after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which means around the year 70. I like to say that when people lose things, they get busy. Remember the storms of 2011, April 2011. St. Luke's changed. And of course, St. Luke's changed through the pandemic too. Gosh, think about that storm. But I'm thinking about the storms of 2011. We became an outreach center here, not just in a way that wrote checks. We became a powerhouse through that experience, helping rebuild Pratt City, being a toilet paper collection station. I mean, just things we never dreamed of before, right? When you lose, you get busy. And then think about what's happened post-COVID disruption, how we've reinvented ourselves into a restaurant. I hope somebody got something yummy to eat this morning. We're a restaurant, we're a television station, we've got a radio presence, and if we need it, we've got all sorts of things that we never dreamed of before. I never dreamed, and we're streaming this all over the place. And this is also a podcast that's released on Mondays that reaches tens of thousands of people I've never met and will never see. So pandemics change things. Trouble changes things. When the temple was destroyed in Jerusalem by the Romans in the year 70, Christian people wrote down the Gospels because they didn't have the temple to go home to anymore. Christian people saw themselves as an extension of just the Jewish family. They saw themselves as Jewish people who believed that Jesus was the dream come true, right? And with the temple gone, they needed to start writing stuff down so that they would have something. Our Jewish friends did the same thing. Temple Emmanuel is a good example of what we call rabbinic Judaism, which is a Judaism without the temple. They got busy too. And so when you lose things, you get busy. Okay, so that's the first three. But that's the first three Gospels. John's Gospel is different, the fourth. First of all, it's written at the turn of the 1st and 2nd century. So it's written about the year 100, which means that it's got about 70 years of reflection when it's written, which means that also it's written by Greek-speaking Roman people in a context that they may not understand Jewish things right away. It has to be explained to them. In other words, they're from a different culture. It's written with Greek philosophy in mind, especially ideas from people like Plato, who had an idea of shadowlands or light and dark, or what happens in eternal life. Another big thought in John's Gospel is the idea of the Word, the Logos, becoming human, meaning that the God's spoken Word suddenly becomes a person. They had time to think about this stuff. They had enough distance between the Jesus event and the spread of the gospel into their world that they could begin to define and determine what happened. Sometimes, right, it takes a little reflection to figure out what. Sometimes when we're in the middle of something in our lives, we don't understand what's happening, but maybe 10 years from now, we can look back on it and see pattern, or see purpose, or see that we were in the right place at the right time, that kind of stuff. So John's Gospel is different. It's more theological, and it's more reflective than the first three, which were more of a real-time remembering that Jesus came and healed someone, or Jesus did this. As a matter of fact, in the first three Gospels, you see a lot of miscomprehension about who Jesus is. In the fourth Gospel, we always know who Jesus is. We always know. We're told by this narrating voice, if you will, all the time that Jesus is the Logos become human. Now, that's the way the fourth Gospel is different. But then there are other couple key things that will help us read the story today. If the first three Gospels center on Galilee and the Passover, the fourth Gospel centers on Sukkot and Jerusalem. If the first three Gospels are rural, John's Gospel is urban. Most of John's Gospel takes place in Jerusalem and a different festival. So what is Sukkot? So we all know about the Passover, I think, because we've seen the movie, The Ten Commandments, and we know our communion words, but Sukkot's a little different. Sukkot involves water, and the title of this class is called Living Water, because I'm looking at water stories in the Bible. Because it was a fall festival, Sukkot would be a festival in which you would be sure and pray for rain over the winter months so that your crops would grow and you wouldn't die. So I just returned from Israel with my son last week, and someone asked me about the weather over there. It's rainy and cool just like it is here. It's very similar to here, except that it's so dry over there that the rain, it doesn't stay wet on the ground for very long. And they're very happy about the rain. Rain puts them in a really, really good mood. The Sea of Galilee is really high right now, which means that they'll have plenty of water. They'll have all that they need, in the coming months. This is when they get their water. There'll be no other time. So Sukkot in the fall would be a time to say, please, Lord, let it rain. And they would do it in some specific ways. Did somebody see the news that they are expanding the Pool of Siloam? Did y'all see some of that? Some of y'all actually sent me that article. Okay. So what happened was in 2004, I think that's pretty close, they found the steps to the Pool of Siloam. And the Pool of Siloam, I've got a map behind me. I know it's crude, but this will give you an idea of travel to worship in the time of Jesus. Let's just imagine that you've traveled for Sukkot. And the walk from Galilee, where Jesus is from, would be about 5 days. The walk is 5 days. The distance is the same as Birmingham to Montgomery, to give you a visual, okay, or Huntsville to Birmingham. And so they would walk for 5 days down the Jordan River Valley, usually hot and dusty, very little water. You got to stay close to the river so that you don't perish down there, deepest crack in the earth. And then they would climb 4,000 feet up out of that hole, the Jordan Rift Valley, to Jerusalem. And the first thing that would greet them would be this large pool. And the Pool of Siloam was for washing your body. This morning in New Creation, our children, if some of y'all have children in New Creation, they're going to learn about manna to feed the body and Jesus to feed the soul. Well, there's a little similar idea in Jerusalem. They would have the Pool of Siloam to wash their bodies, and then as they traveled up this road, and I'm just imagine that this is the original city of Jerusalem. These are houses, okay? And today there is a Palestinian neighborhood over all of this, which I'll show you just a minute in a picture. But they would wash their bodies here, and then they would walk up this road some 300 feet. It's a pretty steep grade, to the southern steps of the Temple Mount, where they would wash their souls in a ritual bath called a mikveh. These mikvah or mikvaot would be the plural. These were regulated by priests who were called Baptists. So a big drama in our Gospels is when one of these Baptists walked away from this grand industrial religion and went down to the Jordan River, right, to wash in a natural mikvah. So that's maybe you're getting a little bit of a color, if you will, of how it worked in those days. And what I want you to think about too, in a world with very little water, it would be exciting to come to Jerusalem, and the first thing to greet you would be a pool, not silver and gold. I mean, water is how you wow the crowds, right? Just an abundance of water. So, what happened in 2004, if I'm remembering, is that these southern steps of the Pool of Siloam were found. Okay, and it's not showing. Henry, if you come down here to the studio, maybe you can, if you see me, Henry, can come down and make that work. But until then, they found just the steps. So they're in a Palestinian neighborhood, and they have just the steps and then some mud. And we knew that the Pool of Siloam was really big, but you had this court order that you couldn't disrupt the neighbors. I mean, folks got to live, right? They got to go on with their daily lives. The neighborhood is called Silwan, which is an Arabic derivation of Siloam. It's always been there. And so what they were able to do is they were able to purchase the land and now begin to excavate the total of the Pool of Siloam. So instead of just having the steps right here and some mud, they're able to make the whole thing. The other thing that they're doing, and again, if we're able to get the pictures, I'll show you. If not, I'll show you next week, is they're able to uncover this road. And what's fascinating about it is it's underneath the neighborhood. They've spent as much money on the arches not to disturb the houses as they are on the road itself. But eventually, within the next couple of years, you'll be able to travel to Jerusalem. So if some of you who are old pilgrims with me, there's always a reason to come back because they're always finding new things. You'll be able to see the entirety of the Pool of Siloam and then walk it all the way up to the southern steps. Is that Henry? Did he? Oh, something came up. Let's see if the picture will come up. Nope. Okay, well, the eye in the sky might see this and soon, and I'll get to show it to you. Okay, but you'll be able to walk this whole thing, which is really, really remarkable. And so, yay! Okay, see how the steps end with the wall there? See that, right? So what they're able to do, they were able to just do this in the last couple of weeks. So I was just here and I got to see it. Now they're beginning to take the whole thing out. So this is the construction. Okay, this is my son Copeland on the road. So you'll be able to, so that's what it'll be like. You'll walk in a tunnel. Isn't that cool? You walk in a tunnel all the way to the top. And then this piece of art gives you a visual of what Siloam looked like at the time of Jesus, which is really good. Right? It's just this big, wet pool, which would be really exciting. Okay, now I've given you a little bit of their world in the festival of Sukkot. Now let me go up 30,000 more feet and talk about the Hebrew Scriptures versus the New Testament as we have it. Now, I want to remind you what I tell every third grader at Bible Club, which starts this week, that the Bible is a library. The word means books. It's a library of books. And so you can't really read it like a book. I mean, you can read it like a book front to back, but if you do it that way, that'd be a little like going to the library and pulling a book off the shelf and reading it and then pulling the second one off the shelf, right? And you might pull off a reference book, or you might pull off an encyclopedia, you might pull off, write a law book or something. So you need to understand that they're all different kinds of books with different purposes. However, you can see pattern. At the end of the prophet Malachi, which is 400 years before the birth of Jesus, and then with the beginning of the Gospels, especially Mark's Gospel, which begins with one of these priests called a Baptist, John, going out into the wilderness and walking away. You see two different worlds. Now, a lot happened in those 400 years between the end of the Hebrew Scriptures and the beginning of the Gospels. I mean, a lot of history happened. People were born, people died, they rebuilt the temple, different foreign rulers ruled over them. They had a heroic war called the War of the Maccabees, the Hasmonean dynasty. They got their country back. Lots and lots of things happened in that gap that we don't have in our Scriptures. But what I can tell you is that 60 years before the birth of Christ, the Romans came, which was a bad thing. Do you remember, I've got a good analogy for this. I'm not going to quote it because we're in church and I don't want the kids to see. But the movie Goodfellas, are y'all familiar with Goodfellas? Okay, the Roman government's a little like Polly, and that you don't want Polly to own your restaurant. You know what I'm saying? It's like, I can't pay my rent, pay me. And my business is no good, pay me. And you don't want and so the Romans, you don't want the Romans to run your world. But what happened is 60 years before Jesus, they stepped into a destabilized sort of government, destabilized area, and everything just sort of got deadened. The bad part about the Romans would be taxes. They weren't free. And then with the Roman administration came a wicked king named Herod. We all remember Herod the Great, client king of the Romans, and also the only person allowed to be given the title King of the Jews, which is ironic because he wasn't Jewish. And it's also ironic because that's the sign they hung over Jesus' head when they killed him for fun, right? King of the Jews. So this King of the Jews was a builder, and to take people's mind off of this deadening taxation to the point that rolling tax debt would run you off your ancestral land, so you'd have to live in places like Nazareth and become a laborer like Jesus' stepdad. I mean, this is all contextual. This is the Roman world in which they lived, and so Herod would build things to take their minds off of their misery. And he rebuilt the temple, which formerly had just inhabited a hill. At the top of the hill here, he turned this Temple Mount into a tabletop structure that's about 6 football fields. Crazy thing with huge stones. We're not even sure how he did it. We're not sure how he quarried them and got them here. Their engineers were amazing. He built a seaport called Caesarea Maritima out of underwater concrete. I mean, just crazy stuff in the first century. He was able to build a tabletop, a fortress called Masada, which was a super weapon that had enough water in a world with no water, had water in its cisterns for 1,000 people to live there for 10 years. But he used it for a heated swimming pool. I mean, the dude was crazy, right? He could build anything. And so these things are still here. They're wonders of the ancient world. There's a mystery to how they even built them. And we're told by a historian named Josephus, who was a client of the Romans, that he even at one point had a sign on the side of this Temple Mount that said, "Your tax dollars at work." So nothing will take your mind off your misery like a building project. Hey, that's how Vulcan got to the top of Red Mountain, because the Depression hit us pretty hard. So what are we going to? Let's take Vulcan from the fairgrounds and put him on the top and give somebody a job. I mean, that's sort of what happens here. And so here's what I want you to imagine. End of the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament for us ends 400 years before Jesus. So the curtain closes. When the curtain arises, it's a different world. In the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament, you see God's people wondering, learning, becoming less monolatrous, which simply means that I acknowledge that my God is God, but there are other gods out there too, that just my God can beat up your God, and becoming more monotheists, that, oh wow, there's only one God over everything, that the golden calf really isn't real at all, right? You see this in the Old Testament, you see this dawning, growing awareness. When the curtain rises in the Gospels, Rome and Herod are in charge. The temple is the wonder of the ancient world, and everything is just sort of flat and fixed, and everybody knows the Romans are in charge, and there's hope is kind of dead. It's a little like Star Wars. You know, the Empire is just everywhere, right? And you can't get away from it, and they almost can't find any hope. Which makes John the Baptist walking away from this so dramatic and so radical, if you will, in their world. In other words, you see the curtain rise, and 10 commandments have now become 613, and you've got an aristocratic priestly class that are just kind of on top of the world, in collaboration with the government, if you will, and you've got a whole lot of have-nots and just a few haves. You get in the picture they're making here, and so that's the radical backdrop, if you will, of first of all John the Baptist, and then his cousin Jesus of Nazareth in Galilee, preaching freedom in the world. So I'm thinking here that this is a good backdrop for the story of the woman caught in adultery, because the 7th commandment became something else by the time you get to the world of Jesus. The 7th commandment had become something else. It's rooted. The 7th commandment is thou shalt not commit adultery. But remember, 10 commandments became 613. The books of Leviticus, especially chapter 20 and Deuteronomy chapter 22, are both specific, if you want to look it up, on what will happen to you if you're caught in adultery. They were really angry about it. They got really specific about what they would do. I think it was a little bit of a misplaced punishment, and I'll tell you how, and I'll tell you why I think this happened this way. I'll use an analogy. When we first came to town, meaning the Webster family, in 2004, St. Luke's used to do something called Created by God. We still do it, by the way. Created by God for our 5th and 6th graders, and in 2004 it was more like health class, how our bodies work. And our 5th and 6th graders, it's very important to take it, but my poor daughter, Betsy, right, she's 5th grade, new to town, here, go to Created by God. I mean, like, St. Luke's is brand new to her, and this is like the first thing she does is Created by God. And I remember picking her up, I said, Betsy, how was it? And she said, I can't talk about it. You know, so it was just like, right, it's like, I'm so sorry, Betsy. It's traumatic enough to move. Welcome to health class. Okay, but in time, because of the ubiquity of pornography and the filth that's on the internet, we changed the trajectory of the class. It used to be how our bodies work. Now the class is still called Created by God. Now the class is people are not things. Do you hear what I said? People are not things. And I believe that this is the root or the zeroing in or the intent, if you will, of the 7th commandment. People are not things. Don't use people in this way. People can get really hurt by this, right? In other words, people are not things. If we use people in this way, we hurt the extended family system. We hurt their soul. We have this searing psychic harm, if you will. People are not things. And so instead, because men are in charge of religion, it became something a little more technical and objectifying, if you will. And certainly we know if you keep up with the news in Iran, what happens to women when they step outside of the patriarchal male kind of order of things, right? And in other words, people are not things became something different. It became hypocritical. And it is in this world, at the festival of Sukkot, that people bring a woman to Jesus who've been caught in adultery. Now, a couple things I want to remind you. Sukkot involves, it's a lot of fun. It's a fun festival. It involves sukkah, the tents. In other words, there are dwellings here, and there's privacy, and there's drinking, and I'm sure this isn't the first time this ever happened in Sukkot. So the backdrop of this story is very real, and these men bring this pitiful person to Jesus because they're not interested in her. They're trying to trap him. So let's read John chapter 8. I know I've talked a lot, but we'll see if we can't get something out of it. Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning, he came again to the temple, and all the people came to him and sat down and began to teach them. And the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and making her stand before all of them, they said to him, Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now, in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. That's the Leviticus 20 and the Deuteronomy 23. Okay? Commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say? They said this to test him so that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And when they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. And once again he bent down and wrote on the ground. And when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the elders. Now Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus straightened up and said to her, Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? And she said, No one, sir. And Jesus said, Neither do I condemn you. Go on your way, and from now on do not sin again. Now, if y'all remember, when I opened up this lesson, I said this comes with a mystery. And the mystery is this. Older manuscripts don't have this story in it. Now, in archaeology or in science, the older the manuscript, the more valuable. A good analogy that I use for this are the Dead Sea Scrolls. The reason why the Dead Sea Scrolls are valuable, and there are lots of creepy books about the Dead Sea Scrolls, about what they say, and end of time and all that. No, the reason why the Dead Sea Scrolls are valuable is because it has copies of the same Hebrew scriptures that Jesus read, which before the earliest copies we might have had would be 400 years after Jesus. So we know that Jesus read the same Bible that we did. The older the manuscript, the more valuable. So, of all the ancient manuscripts of John that we have from the 4th to the 6th centuries, only one includes the story. The Greek fathers from this part of the world, they don't mention this story. The Syrian Orthodox Church doesn't mention this story. The Coptics don't mention this story. The Egyptians don't mention this story. And yet, Jerome, who was a Latin father, included it in his Vulgate Bible from the 4th century. Now, y'all may or may not remember the word Vulgate, but it's one of the most important medieval things you could have in the developing Western world. St. Jerome actually wrote the Vulgate Bible in Bethlehem. And when I take groups down there, it's always too long of a line to wait to touch the star where the baby Jesus was born, which really probably didn't happen there. And so it's certainly not worth 3.5 hours. But what we'll do instead is we'll go to a cave adjacent, because any cave can be the place where Jesus was born. Any cave can be a stable. And actually, there's a cave adjacent to this place where people wait in 3.5 hours, and it's the cave where Jerome wrote this Bible, which is really, really interesting. So you get to see something for free, and there's no line, okay? But Jerome did include this story. So the Latin fathers did talk about this story, and then one of the Augustine mentioned it. He's a Latin theologian, as well as Ambrose. They would comment on it. And then finally, a church historian named Eusebius would say that a bishop was quoting the story around the year 100. Okay, here's what I'm trying to say. One part of the church didn't talk about it at all. One part of the church was not afraid to talk about it and even remembers it historically. So what's the deal? Well, Augustine said it in his own commentaries. This forgiveness story is a great scandal for a lot of people. I think that it was probably not mentioned because it's such a hot potato that men avoided it. They avoided it because it has to do with women, and it has to do with adultery, right? And it's salacious, and nobody wanted to talk about it because Jesus forgave her. It's right. Grace is a scandal. Great forgiveness and second chances and love and acceptance in this way. You know, we don't want to hear God being that, right? There's got to be consequences. We don't hear about God forgiving someone like this. A good analogy for this, and I think in analogies, was what I learned in seminary about the book of Hebrews. You know, we say that Paul's letter to the Hebrews, we say that, but we really don't know who wrote the letter to the Hebrews. Paul wrote some of the letters in the backs of our Bibles, and then students of Paul wrote some of the letters in the backs of our Bibles, but the letter of the Hebrews is a mystery. We don't know who wrote it, and yet it's written in elegant Greek, and it's tight and it's smart, and my professors believe for many good reasons that Hebrews was written by Priscilla, a woman, Priscilla and Aquila, Paul's friends. In other words, the reason why nobody knows who wrote it is they didn't want it a girl writing a book of the Bible. You see how that works back then? I mean, they just want to tamp that stuff down, just like the woman caught in adultery. Now that you've got a little bit of background and some color, right? Their world, Sukkot, the manuscript, the mystery. Let's see if we can draw something out of the story, and also remembering that the seventh commandment, in its essence, is people are not things. They bring this pitiful person. By the way, they don't bring the man. Okay, right? Right. Preach it, Rich. And so they don't bring the man. And so they bring this pitiful person to Jesus, and in response, he draws on the ground. Now, there have been rivers of ink spilled on why Jesus wrote on the ground. I've heard every sermon. I think I've preached every sermon possible on this. Maybe he was writing the names of the Pharisees. Maybe he was killing some time, just kind of dawdling them. Give them a minute to think about how wrong they are. I mean, there are a lot of ways to think about this. Until last summer, while I was doing research for Living Water, looking for water stories in the Bible, basically, you take the word water and you just start reading the Bible, and you just find it everywhere. And I'm reading the book of Numbers, chapter 5, on the beach. On my vacation, I'm reading Numbers, right? That's pretty weird. And I'm reading Numbers chapter 5, and I'm learning that, I'll just read it to you. If you're taking notes, you can write it down. I'm going to read this to you. So, what do you do when someone is accused of adultery and you can't prove it? Well, you take them to the priest, and the priest will take dust from the floor of the tabernacle. It goes like this, Numbers chapter 5. Then the priest shall bring her near. Oh, it's always her, by the way. Bring her near and set her before the Lord, and the priest shall take holy water in an earthen vessel and take some of the dust that is on the floor of the tabernacle and put it into the water. Okay, here's where I'm going to paraphrase. This is so unfair. Then she drinks it, right? And if she has any kind of intestinal distress, then she's guilty. It's a little like the Salem witch trials, right? If you drown, you're innocent, right? It's a no-win. It's a no-win kind of deal, right? But what I think is happening here is, here's my take. Jesus is drawing his finger in the dust of the temple because he's assuming the authority of the high priest. In other words, they know what's coming next. He's about to render a verdict. Forgiveness with authority. Yikes. Wow. I mean, this story doesn't end the way that they see it's coming. I mean, it's a bomb. It's a revealing story, and it's remarkably honest about the scandal of grace. And grace is a scandal. God's forgiveness and mercy are wider than we can absolutely comprehend. And there will be times when God's forgiveness of someone else will pinch. But the fact remains is that people are not things, and they were treating her as a thing, and I'll show you how. Another principle of the Hebrew Scriptures that you'll see again and again is God is the God of names. And this woman didn't have a name. They didn't know her name. They didn't care about her name. But God is the God of names. In Exodus, Moses knows God's name, and God knows Moses' name. Read Jeremiah, right? Before you were in the womb, I knew your name. God knows names. They didn't know her name. And again, Jesus will say this. It's not just John's gospel. It's in the first three. Judge not, lest ye be judged, right? Don't look at the speck in your neighbor's eye. You look at the plank in your own eye. Again and again, Jesus says, go and sin no more. I don't judge you. I forgive you. But go and sin no more. Now, that last part is key because we're not left with our appetites and we're not left with our sin. Now, Episcopalians don't like to talk about sin. As a matter of fact, we hate tacky worse than sin, I think. But sin means separation. Sin simply means that God loves us too much to leave us separate from God and each other. Sin means aloneness. Sin means slave to our appetites. What he tells her is, whatever you did, I forgive you. Don't do it anymore so that you can be returned, if you will, to the community, so that you can be returned to the company of other people, so that you can step back into the light of health. You know, sin is, I want us to get us away from this idea of sin as God is a celestial sheriff wanting to shoot us when we do something wrong, right? You broke a commandment, you get the flu, that kind of thing. No, it's not that. We hurt ourselves when we step out of communion with God and with each other. And so he's saying to this woman, I'm sorry you got hurt, and I'm sorry you've been hurt. Go, return, sin no more. And so we see grace with consequences, grace with a new start, grace with a chance to start over, grace with a second chance. But she's not left in her state, but rather she's returned to her family. People are not things. So that's what I've gotten out of John chapter 8, and I'm going to turn this off now and thank everyone who watched it online and see if you might have a question.